Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm super stoked to be here, and of course, thank you for not tapping out and going home or going to sleep at the end of the day, because I know when we get to the last session of the day, it can be pretty hard. I know, I empathize. So yeah, today I'm not particularly great with, well, sometimes I'm great with titles, sometimes I'm not, but I went for Nerds on a Plane. We're kind of not really talking about nerds on a plane, but I wanted to go snakes on a plane sort of thing. So I already had an introduction, but I just like an excuse to put up pictures of my dogs because they're cute. But I work for Microsoft. I've been working in security for about 10 years. I love talking about how we can secure things, and I spend a lot of my time now kind of apologizing for security to other parts of IT. I did write some books, I have a podcast, but most importantly, I have really cute dogs, which are sadly not here, and they're back in Melbourne. And before I begin, because most of you here, I know there will be some security people, but I think DDD tends to be more of a dev audience. Raise your hand if you ever feel like you've been personally victimized by security. Really? That's it? I don't believe the rest of you, but so I'd like to apologize. I'm sorry. Security, we have kind of been terrible to other bits of IT over the years. I really apologize. We're getting better. I will say that please come and talk to us. We are getting much better at being collaborative, I know, and that we want to actually help you do a thing and whatever you're trying to do. And also, we'll actually have a look at this in today's presentation. So, what am I talking about today? I have spent a lot of time on planes, particularly in the last 5 years, but not at that little bit during COVID. And I think they are great bits of kit. That's what my mum calls them. She's like, oh, planes, great bits of kit. And I was like, yes, mother, that is what they are. But they are amazing engineering. A fun fact, when I was younger, till I was about mid-20s, I was actually really scared of planes. I was terrified. My mum used to be scared of flying, and I think I picked it up off her. Now, I am living proof that exposure therapy works because I've been on planes so much, I don't care anymore. But, of course, during the pandemic, didn't go on them as much, but I've always found them really fascinating. I think there's so much stuff that goes into them. I don't understand all of it, but it's really interesting. And so today, what I want to talk about is the Swiss cheese model of safety. It's not an aviation-specific thing, but we're going to talk about it. We'll talk about aviation safety management systems, how aircraft investigations and accidents are actually assessed, and then we'll talk about some notable aircraft accidents over the years and what we can take away from this as IT professionals, and particularly anyone who's in any way involved in security. So, maybe slightly obvious trigger warning here, but I'm going to talk about aircraft accidents. I'm going to talk about things where planes plunge to the ground and kill everybody. So if that's something that you're not into, or you have a particular fear of flying, you may want to go that way. I will not be insulted. Of course, might be an obvious trigger warning, but I feel like I need to spell it out. I would feel guilty if I upset anyone. Oh, and also a disclaimer before I begin. I find planes interesting, but I would not classify myself as a hardcore aviation person, not hardcore. So I'm going to talk about all these things, but if I get some of the little details slightly wrong, I'm sorry. You can come tell me at the end, please do. But I might not get everything 100% right. So please forgive me if you do consider yourself to be one of those aviation people. I'm trying hard. So, first of all, let's talk about the Swiss cheese model of safety. This is an awesome model. Now, it's not just used in aviation, it's also used in medicine, and it is what we use in security, although we don't really call it this. It's commonly known as the Swiss cheese model. Its official name is Reason's model. It's named after a guy called Reason who actually studied at the university I went to, which is crazy. But the idea is that you have layers of safety controls. And if one of them fails, there's another safety control that will stop something bad happening. And they come in two bits. We have active failures and latent conditions. So active failures are things that go actively wrong, say someone makes a mistake, and latent conditions might be bad weather or other things that can all ultimately lead to an accident happening, but they're sort of out of our control. And if you look at airline accidents, which is what we're going to do, you'll see that multiple things go wrong before we have these disastrous accidents that are on the TV that scare people and make a lot of people scared of flying. And in security and IT, it's exactly the same. Who has heard at some point the phrase defense in depth? Yeah, most of you. This is defense in depth. We just gave it a different name. The idea is, of course, that we have multiple layers of security controls. So if one fails, another one, ideally, will block what's happening. And it doesn't get to this where there's a straight line and we go all the way through and we have a horrible security incident. Now, I would argue we're probably not as great as the aviation industry at dealing with this. This is an amazing animation I found. It's actually to do with, this is Swiss cheese model with COVID-19, and COVID-19 in New Zealand. Now, you will remember that New Zealand also put in border controls and lockdowns, similar to Australia. I know different states did it in different ways, but you can see New Zealand did border closures and border controls. And then they also started isolating people, putting them in hotels, like Australia. Then they also did at the other end physical distancing, hand washing, people coughing and sneezing with masks on, staying home if you were sick, cleaning surfaces. That was what individuals did. That's what the country did. And then in the middle, they had testing, contact tracing. Look, all of this is familiar because it was pretty much the same as in Australia. And then they would limit gathering sizes, limits on movement. And again, the idea was that all of these different controls would stop COVID spreading too much. And I just think this is a really, really cool illustration and fairly topical of how this Swiss cheese safety model works. And of course, as you take those controls out, or bits of those controls out, as we did when we started to come out of all these lockdowns, we can see that it was a bit easier to get COVID. So that's kind of it. And so it's really, really interesting that we are using this Swiss cheese safety model everywhere, even though in security, we give it a different name. I'm going to stop that going round again. I couldn't work out a way to get it to stop because it's a GIF, or GIF, whatever. We're not going there. We're not going GIF, GIF. This is not the time or the place. It's the end of the day. So, anybody here done security risk management or had to talk about security risks? Quite a few. Okay, so I'm going to show you some things. In aviation, they call it safety management systems. I want to tell you if some of this stuff rings a bell. Making policies about safety, so that's assigning key personnel and making people accountable. Identifying the hazards, the things that could go wrong, and then risk mitigation, so what do you do to make that less of a risk? Assurance, which is monitoring and measuring those risks and how you're reducing them. And then finally, training and education. Sound familiar? Yeah, this is exactly the same as we do in security. It's identical, apart from the fact this is talking about aviation. But I think what's different, of course, is when aviation things go wrong, as we will see, people die. Now, in security, it is feasible that people could die, of course, especially if you're looking at, say, hospitals or healthcare systems. But generally, people don't die. You just lose your data, and it ruins your life in other ways. But I think that's why perhaps we don't take it as deathly seriously as some other industries do. And here we have safety culture. Now, we talk about security culture as well. I'm sure you all do phishing training and other things like that. Anybody not done phishing training or something similar in their company where you've been sent a fake email? Cool. There's one person. Sorry, I shouldn't point at you, sir. I'm like, there's one person who's never done it. But as you can see here as well, this safety culture, aviation focuses a lot on the people and the culture. And that's exactly what we talk about in security too, because we know that in security, we can have the best technical controls in the world, but if people don't implement them properly, or if someone puts their password on a sticky note or shares it with their friend, it's game over. And that people factor is exactly the same in aviation. So you can see here, they have a just culture, discouraging blaming an individual. We're not great at that in security. reporting, where people aren't penalized for reporting issues, and learning. I don't know how easy that is to see. The light's a bit funny, apologies. But essentially, this is like talking a lot about how people respond to safety or respond to incidents. And I think it's way better than what we do in security. We are getting better, but you may know that definitely when there's a security incident, there's often a scapegoat, unfortunately. And the research does show that if you have a scapegoat, it generally discourages people from reporting things again. And aviation have got way more on top of this than us, and they are strongly promoting you can speak up, there's no retaliation. They're way ahead of us on this. This could maybe a bit small, but again, looks familiar. We have, this is the flow process that they use in aviation for risk management. You can see here, identifying a risk, analyzing how serious the risk is, and then looking at how probable the risk is. Are we seeing patterns here? We've got risk plus probability. Wow, that doesn't sound familiar. And then we have a risk assessment. Are we going to leave it as it is, or are we going to fix it? And then we accept the risk, or we take mitigating action, and then it goes back round. This is identical to what we do in security, which I find just fascinating. And as someone who did this, I did for my sins, work for a Big Four once upon a time, that I did a lot of this. And I just find it personally fascinating. Also, I found these amazing slides. This was all online. I'm just loving the clip art here. This is great. But I think the thing on this slide that I wanted to pull out, as they say, and the ICAO is the International Civil Aviation, I've forgotten the O, but essentially these are the guys, sorry? Thank you. There you go. They are the people who set the standards globally. And you can see here, they say, you've got to maintain a balance between production and protection. Now that is something, as I apologized to you at the beginning of this session, that security have traditionally been very bad at. We've often said, you can't do that, stop, because security, you just can't do it. We haven't given you an alternative, and then that stops people being productive. And I know that the vast majority of you in here will have experienced that at some point in your lives. And I think they do, to a point, have the same challenge in aviation. Of course, if you wanted to be completely safe, you'd never let a plane take off, because there might be a risk that something would happen. But of course, if planes never took off, there would be no aviation industry. So I think it's a really interesting analogy that I really like talking about, is that there's always risk involved in everything. We just have to lower it so we can still get things done, because we can never eliminate risk. But yeah, I love the cheesy clip art there. It's great. And this is some nice stats as well about since the aviation industry really focused on safety, since aviation started maybe in the early 1900s, how the incidents have gone down. And you can see it's pretty impressive curve. I wish that we could have those same kind of stats in security. I don't think we ever will, because there are so many attacks that go unreported or unnoticed, whereas you kind of notice if your plane crashes to the ground. It's a little bit difficult to miss. So it's not quite as easy probably to quantify this with security, but I wish it was, because I would love to see how things have changed since we started taking security even more seriously. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get that. And then here, let's talk about how aircraft accidents are assessed. I've just got one page on this. I wish we did this as thoroughly for any kind of incident that we had in IT, whether it's security or otherwise. For a start, they collect all the evidence. So, of course, bits of planes, bits of people, all those other things, unfortunately. And they will collect absolutely everything they can. They also do interviews with the air traffic control, with everybody who could vaguely be involved to get a real picture. And then they do big examination and analysis. And of course, that will be, again, more interviews, et cetera. They get a lot of experts. They'll look at the way the metal is bent, et cetera, all kinds of things. And then they issue a draft report. The report then gets an internal review. It's externally reviewed. It's approved, and then it's sent around to everybody. This is very, very thorough. It takes a long time. Often aircraft investigation reports don't come out for a couple of years until after the incident. But interestingly, we don't do this level of post-mortem in IT. Again, you don't usually, when you've had some kind of IT security incident, have bereaved families who are very angry, who want an answer in the same way, which is definitely a part of the driver. But also, businesses and organizations can be quite ashamed and scared that they've had an incident and they don't want to talk about it publicly because it looks bad on their reputation. Now, we know that sometimes some things hit the news. So, of course, in Australia last year, there were quite a few high-profile breaches. And there's been a few recently in the US that they couldn't hide it. But there are many businesses and organizations that manage to keep it on the down low. I'm really pleased that in some jurisdictions we are getting, and in Australia, getting legislation that's going to force businesses, or at least some businesses, to report breaches. So hopefully things like this will become much more common, that we'll share knowledge, because it's only by sharing knowledge of things that have gone wrong that we can make things better. And in security, because there's a stigma and a shame and businesses are worried about their reputation and losing customers, we don't do nearly as much sharing as we probably should. So let's talk about a couple of notable accidents that have really changed up, or the ones that I think are particularly interesting and that have changed up how aviation has done things. So, June 2009, Air France, it was a flight that was going from Rio de Janeiro to Paris. So this is relatively recent. When they were flying, about 3 hours into the flight, the pitot tubes got blocked by some ice. They were in a thunderstorm, and it gave the pilots some bad readings. And essentially, long story short, of course, I'm paraphrasing and making a short version. The pilots who were more junior, the captain was on his break, they got confused, and they managed to stall the plane. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a plane stall is, it is not a car stall. It is different. It's an aerodynamic stall, and an aerodynamic stall is when the wings of the plane stop generating lift, and that's when the plane kind of drops out of the sky. It's something you don't want to happen, and unsurprisingly. And it was pilot error, and essentially when the pitot tubes, they're the tubes that give air and speed readings and things like that, they got blocked, they were giving weird readings, and the pilots were essentially too reliant on the automation and the autopilot and didn't know what to do. Something I haven't put on the notes here, but basically they got the captain back in the cockpit as they were plunging to the ground. I mean, it takes a few minutes when you're up at cruise altitude, and the captain did notice, they've worked out from the transcript, that the captain did realize what was happening, but by the time he got back on the deck, the plane was too low and they couldn't recover it, and it hit the water, and that was the end of that. Not amazing. Going back a little bit further in time, though, this is a plane. This is the first jet plane called the de Havilland Comet, and it was built in the 1950s. So before the 1950s and before jet planes, we just had propeller planes. Now, jet planes meant that the planes could go faster and they could fly higher, and they want them to fly higher because, of course, that's more fuel efficient and you can go further with less energy. But in order to go higher, and you may or may not know that when you go above about 10,000 feet, the air pressure, the pressure drops, and it's hard for you to breathe. And so we pressurize cabins. So when you fly, I'm sure you probably know this, but when your ears pop, when you ascend or descend, that's the pressure changing. And having a pressurized cabin meant that there's higher pressure inside the plane than outside the plane. So that's why we have to build planes in a particular way. There were a few crashes of this plane in the 1950s, quite close together, and at that time, there wasn't a lot we didn't have black boxes, and aircraft investigations were very much in their infancy. Turns out, though, that in fact, the reason this happened was because, you can see this just about on the picture here, the Comet had square windows, not the oval windows that we have today. And what was happening was when the plane was taking off and landing and taking off and landing, the squarish or squarer corners of the window were actually fatiguing, and then the plane blew out, the pressure blew out, and essentially the plane kind of blew up from the inside. And that's what happened. There's also something, before anyone corrects me, there is also some question about the front windows as well. So I know that there's some debate about that. Unfortunately, because they don't have any recordings, it's a little bit tough to tell. But essentially, it was the design of the windows. And that's because, of course, this was something that, what went wrong was that the pressurized cabin was putting excess strain on the window shape. They didn't have black boxes in the 1950s to help them. So it took basically them going through a few wreckages before they worked out what happened. They didn't have accident investigation procedures, so they couldn't, when the first crash happened, they didn't work out what happened quick enough, so it happened a few more times. And of course, pressurized cabins were new technology, and the risks just weren't understood. They didn't know what they didn't know. This next one is, again, not too long ago, only about 13 years ago. Air Blue, that is, if you've never heard of it, they are an airline in Pakistan. I believe they still exist. And this was a flight from Karachi to Islamabad. Now, the plane, you can kind of see it on here, I'll stand back. Basically, the plane was supposed to land here at the runway, but it was supposed to go around here and then land. But the plane came up here and crashed into mountains, which clearly was not what was supposed to happen. And essentially, the first officer noticed there was a problem, and he didn't feel he could challenge his captain, because at the beginning of the flight, the captain had basically grilled him. He'd grilled him for an hour, and this is all on the voice recorder, and it wasn't a training flight. He just laid into him, asking him questions like, what about this, what about this, and yeah, and then basically the first officer felt he couldn't speak up when he realized that they were actually going the wrong way. Also, some other things that made the Swiss cheese model line up here was that the airport air traffic control, was it? Now I've forgotten. It was Islamabad. They didn't have radar, so they didn't know where the plane was, so they had no idea they were going off in completely the wrong direction. And the captain decided that he wouldn't, when planes land, every airport has a minimum descent level. So at this airport, it was 2,500 feet. If they can't see the runway at that point, they're supposed to go around and try again. So the captain decided, for reasons unbeknownst, that he would ignore that and keep going down further, which clearly didn't help. And they were also doing a non-standard approach to the airport that wasn't documented. So essentially, there was a lot of different things that lined up here to go wrong. This was investigated, airline investigations are always investigated by generally the country that the airline is in or the accident happens. But in Pakistan, the aviation authority isn't very good compared with other ones. And basically, they just say it was the pilot's fault and they're dead now, so there's nothing else we need to do. Which is clearly oversimplifying it. And again, scapegoating someone when clearly some of these things like doing non-standard approaches, ignoring minimum descent levels, things like that, which are big no-nos, points to like a bigger airline culture issue, but that was never investigated, which is a shame, of course. Now, this is a very famous one, going back a bit further from the 1970s. This is called, it's known as the Tenerife air disaster. This was the biggest loss of life in a single airline accident, even today. It was 583 people died, and essentially 2 jumbo jets collided into each other on the runway at Tenerife. One was a KLM and one was a Pan Am. And of course, Pan Am doesn't exist anymore. This was the captain from KLM. He was an older dude. As you can see, he was on their adverts. And he didn't actually fly that much anymore because he was a training captain. Anyway, there's a lot of things that went wrong here. But essentially, neither plane should have been at that airport to begin with. They were actually supposed to be going to another airport, but that airport had a bomb scare, so they were all diverted to Tenerife. Tenerife had no ground radar, so the air traffic control couldn't see where the planes were, and then they got really heavy fog. And basically, the air traffic control and the pilots, they were not speaking to each other clearly. The KLM captain, the gentleman, Captain Van Zantem, the gentleman on the picture before, he really wanted to get home because he just did. And so while he was waiting at Tenerife, no joke, this is serious, he actually makes comments on the voice recorder. When they were at Tenerife, because they were going to have to make a hop back to the airport they were supposed to be at and then go back to Amsterdam, he decided he was going to fuel up before he left Tenerife to save some time whilst they were waiting. That made the plane heavier because, of course, fuel weighs things, and it meant he had a longer takeoff roll. So basically, essentially what happened was the KLM pilot, the Pan Am was taxiing, the KLM basically started taking off and bashed into it. It clipped the top of it. Now, they're not sure because they can't be sure, had he not refueled, they think maybe they might have cleared it, but because they were heavier. And again, you could see so many things lining up for an awful tragedy to happen. And also the captain, this one, no one was speaking their native language apart from the Pan Am flight. There's obviously Tenerife is Spanish speaking. And if there's any Dutch people in the audience, Dutch people have amazing English, but it is technically not your native tongue. And they were, and also, I don't think I put it on here, but also the first officer did actually say to the captain of the KLM, "Are you sure Pan Am's not on the runway?" I paraphrase. And he was like, no, they're fine, they're gone. And because he was very senior, he didn't make any more fuss about it. So again, so many different things lined up for that accident to happen. And then the very last one I'll talk about, I could go on forever. There's so many interesting ones. And even if you're not big into planes, I just think that there's so many things different little things that lined up to create an accident is just fascinating to me. There's an Air India flight in 1985 that went from Montreal, London, Delhi to Bombay. This is when planes still did quite multiple hops. And the plane was blown up over the Atlantic Ocean by a Sikh terrorist group that were wanting an independent Sikh state in India. And as you can see, 300 people died. A 747 is a big plane. Now, the bomb was in luggage that was checked into the hold of the plane. The terrorist group also, coincidentally, planted another luggage bomb the same day on a flight going to Japan. But that plane got all the way to Japan, and it actually blew up on the ground, and it killed an airport baggage handler, but the plane, obviously everybody else was okay. And it wasn't okay for the baggage handler, clearly, but wasn't as disastrous. So what happened here, though? Now, this, I think, is a fascinating one for social engineering. Essentially, what happened was the gentleman who was the terrorist went to Vancouver Airport and wanted his bag checked all the way through to India, and this wasn't the standard procedure at the time. And he said to the check-in agent said, "No, I can't do that for you. You'll have to pick it up again and check it again." Now, the reason he didn't want to do that is because he wasn't going to get on the plane because he didn't want to blow himself up. And eventually, he said to her, "This is business class. I'm a business class passenger. How can you do this to me? Blah, blah, blah." And he put a lot of pressure on her, like we see in social engineering situations. And eventually, she relented and said, "Okay, fine, I'll check it all the way through to India." When it got to Toronto, they were scanning, because they did scan luggage in these days, it's not that long ago, but the luggage x-ray machine had broken down. So they were using these hand scanners that they didn't normally use, and the baggage handlers weren't very familiar with them. And in fact, one of them beeped on the bag, but it only made a little beep, not a loud beep, and they'd been told to only pay attention to the loud beep. And so, again, an opportunity was missed to pick up this bag. And the final thing, which we know doesn't happen anymore, is that the bags were allowed in the hold without passengers on the plane. Has anybody had to sit? You must have been on a plane where they said, "We have to offload the baggage because someone hasn't made the flight." This is why. This and one other one are the two main reasons this never happens anymore. So I think, although it's frustrating as heck, because I have sat on many planes where they've had to do this, I understand why. So again, you can see multiple things lining up for these mistakes to happen. And I say fun, it's not a fun fact, but until 9/11, this was like one of the biggest terrorist airline things that actually happened. So what can we learn in tech from this? I think there's a lot of takeaways, in my opinion, but I also find this fascinating, which is too much automation can lead to the loss of essential skills. Now, this is particularly relevant at the moment because, of course, we're talking about AI, and we're trying to see how we can use AI to make our lives easier, but also are we going to lose skills? Are we going to forget how to do things? Because we still need to be able to oversee the automation, and the automation will not be 100% all the time. So we still need to have those base skills to be able to do the thing we need to be able to do. In aviation terms, if we look at that Air France flight, those pilots had not forgotten, but they were rusty at actually just flying the plane because they were used to the autopilot taking care of it, and then that led to, an accident. And no one is infallible. It doesn't matter how senior you are, how great you are, people make mistakes. And so we have to make safe spaces for people to be able to speak up. In a couple of these that I've told you about, the junior pilot, I'd say junior, a first officer who's not ultimately in charge, has noticed or questioned that something wasn't quite right, but they didn't really push it through. Now, interestingly, this is something that is dealt with now in the aviation industry by something called CRM, which is crew resource management. And all pilots nowadays are trained that there is a captain, and the captain's ultimately, there's a chain of command, but everyone, if they feel there's an issue or something critical has been missed, they train them and they say, you must speak up. And to the more senior person, you must listen and you must reassess. And I don't think that's something we talk about really at all in IT, and I think we should, because although maybe a plane isn't going to plunge to the ground and kill people, mistakes can happen. You can have a horrible security breach, and it might have been something that someone has picked up on. Procedures reduce the likelihood of mistakes and misunderstandings. I know that you might all, when I was talking about the risks things, you might have found that a little bit boring, that we're talking about risk and assessing it, the likelihood, then implementing controls, and then reassessing. And I know for those of us who are the doers, who like to be more hands-on technical, that stuff can be a little bit boring. But having procedures and structured ways of doing things is really important to reduce these mistakes and misunderstandings. Same in aviation. Using standard terminology when you're communicating with people stops misunderstandings happening, like in Tenerife, where the captain thought that the air traffic control had told him to go, when in fact he hadn't, and things like that. Everybody is susceptible to social engineering. Everybody. Now, of course, we're all very aware of it. Everybody does training. But good social engineering, they're changing tactics all the time. Everyone is susceptible to it. Don't think you're so smart that you might not accidentally click on a link. Don't become complacent, because everyone is. And then you don't know what you don't know, especially with new technology. So the obvious one being AI at the moment. We don't know all the things. We've got ideas about what security issues we might have with AI, and researchers have shown theoretically some of these attacks, but it's such early days, we don't know what people can do. If you think, when we get new 0 days, if you take Log4j a couple of years ago, I can't believe that was nearly 2 years ago, but if you take Log4j has been around for ages, and then suddenly these were these awful security holes that could be really easily exploited. So we don't know what we don't know. We don't know everything. And thorough postmortems are essential to avoid repeat mistakes and issues. As I was saying, I think aviation is really good at it. Again, probably, of course, there's a lot of pressure from bereaved families if people have died. I don't think we're as good in security. We may do a postmortem, but unless it's been horribly public or it's a government agency, the chances of us sharing that widely so everyone can learn is not great. And I think that's a real shame, and I do hope that changes. And finally, those Swiss cheese holes can and will line up. So you need to try and make it as unlikely as possible. Have lots of layers. And by the way, for the people who've asked me this before, not in this room, but having 6 firewalls is not defense in depth. You need to have multiple different layers. And yeah, that is my talk. Thank you, DDD Perth. Here's a QR code. This will take you to a link with a ton of interesting resources. If you found this stuff interesting, you can go and watch YouTube videos, read some things that I found very interesting. I hope this was interesting and kept you awake for at least your last session of the day. Thanks for making the time, and yeah, have a good rest of your day, evening, whatever you're doing for the weekend, and thanks for coming.
do we have any questions for Sarah? As well. Oops. Who raised it?
Hi. You mentioned about aircraft investigations and how there's usually a central agency or country that takes control to do to do post-mortem. Could you see that sort of thing eventually happening for large-scale security issues?
Maybe. I think definitely for anything public entity, yes. I think for private organizations, it's going to be difficult. I would like to see it, though, at least for large-scale breaches, because it stops. I would like to think that if we had, say, the Australian or ACSC, we have Australian cybersecurity bodies, but say they took responsibility for the large-scale breaches, it would essentially force private companies to share the knowledge of what's happened, and I think that would be a good thing. Realistically, do I think it will happen in the near future? Probably not, but maybe we'll get there in time. I think it would be a positive thing, although I think there would be a lot of pushback from private companies, and I don't know whether the government, because assuming it would be the government, would be able to overcome that pressure and force them to do it, but I would like to see it for sure.
Awesome. Any more questions? Yes.
It's similar to the last question.
Mm-hmm.
What about something like black box recording?
Oh, I'm not sure how you would do that on a security incident in the same way, but I'd say that nowadays, you probably know, like with cloud and everything, we've had an explosion of signals. I call them signals very deliberately because it can be logs, it can be chats and blah, 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 and they generally should form part of the investigation. Is it going to be as thorough as a black box voice recording to understand maybe the people's thinking? Not necessarily. But having said that, if you use Slack or Teams and that's been involved in the security incident, even peripherally, generally nowadays we can pull those logs and take them. So we could potentially get close to that. I don't think at the moment we're very good in security at considering the human factor, though. We will look at, okay, there was a breach. This is technically how this breach occurred, but then we don't go, unlike the aviation industry, we'll just say, oh, so-and-so didn't configure blah, or this team didn't configure blah. I think it's very rare that a company or an organization reflects back on itself and says, hey, okay, we know that team made a mistake, but what in our culture made that team not do the right thing? So I think if we get to that, then maybe they will start looking at, say, transcripts of how people talk to each other in general culture. But I don't think we're mature enough. I think aviation's way ahead.
Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, it's not just people and the systems, it's also the buildings as well. How would that come from aviation as well?
Well, same sort of principle. You're absolutely right. There's physical security as well. Now, physical security, I don't think is that much different because you've got your physical controls, locks, gates, doors, but once again, people are the weakest link because who here holds open doors for people? Who reckons they can tailgate into their office fairly easily without a badge? Yeah. And so I do think it's actually, again, people are the weakest link and education is the way to go, but people are still not super reliable. So I think we don't focus enough on physical things. And I know from being a consultant as well in previous jobs that most organizations will not commission like a physical penetration test unless they're forced to, because they know how badly they will fail and they don't want it written down. So it's definitely a part of it to take into consideration. I think it's even harder with physical testing. If you were going to do a post-mortem of a physical incident, it would be very, very difficult to not blame the person holding open the door or something like that. And from what I've seen in real life is just organizations just basically stick their head in the sand and ignore it, which I don't think is great, but I don't know, it gets buried, the physical side of things. But I think essentially the principles of what we're talking about here are probably about the same.
Any last questions? No. Well, thank you, Sarah. A huge round of applause for Sarah, please.